We're making a new orientation that is oriented totally away from this illusory notion, the cornerstone of your being is progress. We're thinking about quality again. How do I, as an individual, become the highest, most exceptional quality representation of my folk, of my caste, and making that my core identity, and taking the presumption that if I represent quality in itself through my action, the world can be organized into a way that suit my principles. And it may be difficult. I may be ruby-ridged, in my case specifically, droned by the Chinese to death, but I must do it anyway because that is the heroic in you. It is the taking the fire of tradition and wielding it genuinely and building a new destiny for your people through act and deed, with you being the noble master and leading the individuals into the desert to make the oasis.
You do have to go forward. The only way is forward. There is no sort of golden age that we can return to. We can only go forward through this malaise, and that requires using all the instruments and tools available to us to reach that something more that exists at the end of the bridge. Salwete Legionaries, I am joined today from afar in the steppe, the nomadic steppe coming straight from Central Asia. I have Rogue Scholar here today, a very, very special guest. He is friends with a lot of our friends, so that makes him a good friend of ours. He's good friends with our great comrade, Lance's Legion. So we're very happy to have Rogue Scholar joining us here today. Briefly, for the Legionaries that might not be familiar with your work, could you just briefly introduce what you're about, some of the projects you're working on, and your mission presently?
Hi, this is Rogue of Rogue's Philosophy on X.com, CEO of Rogue Expeditions. Formerly, I'm a literature and philosophy professor traveling all around America and Asia, teaching an introductory course to Western thinking, and also doing that through the lens of literature specifically. And now I'm transitioning into building out my extreme adventure company, Rogue Expeditions, where we take different content creators who are on the right and we try to give them monetizable expeditions where they can go and travel in the world. I organize the expeditions, they bring their followers, and we host these international meetups that we're building into an international network. That's phase one. To begin in 2026, we've got all types of expeditions. My favorite one, the longest horseback riding tour in the world, I built myself with my local team of nomads here. We're going to be the first Westerners also to take horses to the deserts of Turkmenistan, specifically the first Americans, may I add. And we've also got some trips to Vietnam, soon moving into the Philippines as well, and just kind of building this international world I have of all these connections with tribal folk and introducing the West to new trade routes.
Absolutely. And Legionaries, if this is something you're interested, maybe you got to start hounding me to join one of these expeditions. If we get enough people, maybe it's something we Legionaries do. But I think one of the things that fascinates me about Rogue is just your life story. We've talked a lot offline about some of the projects that failed and then some of the ones that eventually succeeded and the kind of struggle it took to get to that point. But regardless, I think that it's a really fascinating story that I want the Legionaries to hear. So if you don't mind, can you just briefly tell the Legionaries what got you from coming from this sort of decrepit Western world, the modern world, and then saying, you know what, I'm going to go to live this tribalistic lifestyle? When did that start, and then how did that develop?
Well, it all started when I met Lance, and he just ruined my life. He was a terrible influence on me. He got me interested in all this radical philosophy, and I think from there it just downward spiraled into total psychosis. But joking aside, I was very interested in studying philosophy when I was younger because I was raised by a minister for a grandfather. And my grandfather is not someone who's a very good minister in the sense where I didn't have a conversation with my grandfather about Jesus Christ until I was about 27. I still remember that. So 27 years I'm being raised by this gentleman in my life and who's guiding me in my life. And all he does is talk to me about philosophy and psychology all day, all the time. So I was like motivated as a very young person to fully pursue this as my career. So basically being a professional orator, if you think of it, where I'm speaking about the same ideas that were given to me by my grandfather. I'm studying them as an academic. I'm getting graduate degrees as my highest level of accreditation. And then I'm moving out in the world to live the philosophy that I'm studying as well. And all of my time is spent either in the academy or on these different adventures that I have all over the world. Like, for example, after I graduated from university, I immediately went over to Vietnam, and I was kind of just living on a motorcycle with all of these different tribes. Vietnam has 54 different tribes, 102 different languages. So living in the far north, not like the touristy regions, but like the far north of like the Chinese border and bouncing around all these little tribal groups, I thought was really interesting. And the thing that motivated me to go to Vietnam was I saw all these political conflicts within my nation, within my people. Particularly, I had this very strong disgust for those individuals who were on the radical left, but I also found it very strange that no one on the right would ever do anything. Like the left was always organizing in these controlled opposition demonstrations that were just destroying our nation and most importantly themselves and weakening themselves. And the right would never do anything about this. They would like complain about it on the internet. So I saw this problem with static conservatives, and I saw this problem with radical leftists. And I've always been looking for this kind of core unifying factor and traveling around the world to figure out, well, what exactly would unify these beyond left and beyond right areas of the American political spectrum and reorient us towards the continuation of manifest destiny as our ethos. And when I was in Vietnam, I was specifically, I visited the cave of Ho Chi Minh called Pac Bo, and this is on the border of China in a place called Cao Bang. And when I was in this cave system, this is a cave system where Ho Chi Minh, from the age of 17 or 21, he leaves Vietnam, he goes to live with his enemies in France, he studies the French enemy, he goes to Russia, he gets some investment capital, he goes to China, gets some investment capital, and after 50 years of living overseas, he comes back home and he plots the revolution to take back his country from this small cave. And he was like sleeping on a door. He only owned a teapot and some sandals. And it's not like he was taking transportation between the Chinese border and Vietnam. He was walking back and forth, which I believe gave him a very horrible illness. So I just found this person who I hate communism very much, not as much as Lance. Lance is much more passionate about the hatred of the communists than I am. I can't get to that level. I'm not as professional, but I always hated those leftists the most. And here I was in the enemy encampment, so to speak, the enemy who very successfully defeated the Americans in a massive invasion that we did on their lands. And it was here I should be hating this person. I should be hating the Vietnamese for winning against my empire and the superiority of my empire, tarnishing our will. But here I was sympathizing with him. And I knew in that exact moment, I would be living the same journey where I would be spending decades of my life with the enemy, studying the communist enemy, so to speak, if you will, learning their tactics, learning to think like them, learning how to defeat them with their own principles and bringing that back to my people so that we would then be able to actually organize a proper defense against them. And this eventually led me to moving out and trying to learn from different tribal groups all throughout the world, of which I found the Central Asians the most amenable, and bringing now that idea of the tribal identity as even a concept back to the American, defining the American as a unique ethnic folk, and trying to go throughout and really do a lot of writing that defines the exact ethnic practices of the Americans in a traditional school of philosophy that I'm building, to then give back to my people as an organizational and unifying principle of actionable steps that they can live in real life. And if you're somebody who's very excited about those principles, now I'm opening up the opportunity for people to join me and take these insights and reawaken the blood, so to speak, toward this frontier orientation.
Absolutely. And of course, one of the things I've been working on is creating a mythos of Hapaborea. And who are the oldest Hyperboreans, but not the Central Asians, the people that you're amongst now, of course, being of an admixture of European blood and Asian blood in the steppes. So it's really interesting. But before we go in more into that, what was sort of the process? Because I believe, if I remember correctly, whether I read this or from speaking with you, I think you said it was around COVID that you made some of the first steps to try to create these, I guess, what would you call them? These like tribal communities? What would the name of that project be?
The one that you're referencing here was kind of I was living in Vietnam until about 2020. And funny enough, I got into a really bad motorcycle accident on the border of Vietnam and China. I ran into a dog at like 10 o'clock at night. He like jumped out at me through the jungle, and I like had to pick myself up and find a hospital that was 20 kilometers away at like 12 o'clock in the morning eventually when I woke up from the side of the road, right? So I was in that position, and I'm like limping to get some pho in the morning when I wake up, and I feel like a drunken alcoholic because I've got that little like concussive feeling and the stars are still showing. I sit down for this bowl of pho, and on the news in Vietnamese, they were speaking about like somebody like ate like a bat in China. We don't know what that means. And the reason I was paying attention to that is because I was living, a friend of mine in the local community in the town I was living in was Japanese, and he was actually hospitalized at the same time. Like, it was my friend in the hospital being treated for an injury, and then after that was like the first formal announcement of COVID. And I could see all of these people in China, the videos they were sending, people were like projectile vomiting on the street, walking like zombies, and they were like collapsing in the road. It actually, you could see them spewing blood. And I said, that's a very interesting point of propaganda I should probably think about. And all of my other friends around the world, we started like thinking, is like, okay, this is very clearly a new psyop. We went back to 2010. We read something from the Rockefeller Foundation that said they were going to, like, I don't know, end the war in the Middle East, and then they were going to release a pandemic, which had multiple forms, including a cyber pandemic element to it. And they had released on the WHO websites these vaccination cards before the pandemic actually happened that you could very nicely print out and use to get around once the pandemic was released. And they released that in America, Taiwan, and Mexico, for 3 examples that I have on my personal file. So we perfectly saw the orchestration of this, both living on the literal Chinese border eating a bowl of pho. We saw the propaganda of it, and we knew the pre-propaganda and the United States documents that were even released as early as 2010. So really, I started to lock in at that time and mobilize the allies. And our first project was to just monitor the situation. We're looking at these different trends. Okay, who's falling for this the most? And the West just died, basically. They all agreed, hey, we want to just euthanize ourselves. We'd like to have an 80% vaccination rate right away. So, okay, can't go into America. I'm not touching those people. That's against the law for me. We don't associate with vaccinated folks. Can't stay in Vietnam anymore because they started refurbishing concentration camps that they used to hold American prisoners in and making them quarantine vaccination camps. And the joke that the Vietnamese would use was, well, the Americans loved our time with us so much, they called us the Hanoi Hilton. We used to give them such good service at our torture camps that they named us after the Hilton, the greatest hotel chain in the world. So the whole world seemed to be in on this thing at once. And we needed to go to a place that was free from any vaccination status. We thought everybody was who's gotten vaccinated was going to die immediately, or at the least, we didn't want to taint our genetic bloodlines through mixing with these people. And the only region in the world that was basically free from vaccination was either Africa or Central Asia. And we had this choice at first between Mongolia and Tanzania. And Tanzania was a very interesting investment opportunity because the president was directly saying that it was a scam and that COVID didn't exist. And he tested a pineapple and said it came back positive for the coronavirus. And he said, this is clearly a scam. So he magically died 2 weeks after that statement was released to the public, and the WHO elected somebody else there that was in favor of them. And they got a 67% vaccination rate overnight. The Mongols got a 69% vaccination overnight in a day. I didn't know where to go. And therefore we settled on Armenia, because Armenia, the data suggested, only 34% of the population, particularly in nurses, so the medical community themselves, was getting vaccinated. So that means to me there's a very high level of rebellion, particularly in the West. It would be Armenia, Georgia, and Bulgaria. Bulgaria is still at 24% vaccination, Armenia and Georgia being something in the 40s to 50s range. And we bought a bunch of land in Armenia, and we bought like some hotels, and we were just kind of hanging out there in the wilderness and trying to build a type of settlement there. But I was still in a graduate program at the time. I was in graduate school. I was working with clients online in South Korea, and I couldn't really commit to this particular project. But my allies were very happy to go there, and they had a wonderful farmstead that I was able to visit. And we sat down and we really thought this is where we were going to make our final stand. We had this nice Christian population. We had a highly rebellious population. We had a unique ethnic group of people who had the lowest crime rate in the world. There were all these beautiful and wonderful statistics. And then my partner said, listen, you can't come here fast enough. I don't like talking to people. I'm just going to go buy an island, and we're just going to go take over this island and make our own counter civilization, because we think the technology, the organizational property of it, it's so apparently corruptive when we're looking at the coronavirus pandemic, and everyone refuses to rebel. And not only do they refuse to rebel, they love this ever expansion of the transhuman philosophy encapsulated within a vaccine. They want to die. I can't live with people who want to die. I don't even want to be on this earth. So my friends and I, we decided, okay, we're going to have an orthodox school of thought, which is going to be them. They bought an island. They live on an island now. I won't say where or when. And that group is just fully living in loincloths as kind of like hunter-gatherer farmers, if you will, on their little island. And then my opinion was, well, if I can't live with my friends and I don't really want to be as devoutly against technology as they are, and I don't even know if I have the resources to buy my own island to do that anyway, I may as well live with a just as radical population that I think would be very well integrated with helping my people out, which brings me to other Central Asian groups living with nomads here in Kyrgyzstan. And our nomads are semi-nomadic. So we have different bases and you move between each base in 3-month increments and you raise animals. And I can see a lot of parallels with the Kyrgyz people and the Western people, thinking about the similarity in frontier culture of the Americans and the local folk, thinking about our kind of American Aryan nomadic practices of moving and conquering the West. And here as an educator, it seemed the best place to go because the local folk, everybody in the post-Soviet world, as an educator, presents this marvelous community where they're questioning their identity. And that's what you want to do when you're a philosopher. You want to move into who has the most questions about their being. And they have a question, well, now that we're in the post-USSR phase, do we still want a Soviet empire? Do we want to go back to a Kyrgyz Khaganate? Do we want to be Turkic? Do we want to be Muslim? Should we were Christian for like 5 minutes? Should we do that again? Should we be Tengrianist? So I find with all of these Central Asian peoples, be it Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, being the most interesting of the three, I find it here to be an exceptional place for an educator. One of myself who's taking the ascetic pathway, perhaps you could say, of fully devoting himself to being an academic. I find these populations the best and the most interesting to work with, and then I can develop these rural communities and rural populations with different training projects with my Western partners, and I can create a kind of like nomadic settlement here, if you will, and I can optimize my survival, and I can be that kind of conduit between this tribal world and the Western world, and trying to motivate people with my ideas to get more oriented toward a rebirth of American frontier spirit, if you will. So hopefully that explains your question. This is like a 5-year period. It's a bit difficult for me to condense it down into a statement.
No, I think that that's a pretty good summation. And what I wanted to get into, actually, you're mentioning that it's kind of this Luddite aversion against technology, and you partially share it. But I wanted to get more preliminarily some of your thoughts on technology in relation to maybe some of the more orthodox, I guess, members of this general movement. Where do you stand on it? Because obviously on my channel, we're big futurists, and I know you and I have had certain disagreements in the past regarding technology, but I think we also have very similar prescriptives of what we want the future to look like at the same time, which I think is interesting. So I guess, what are your general views on technology for the audience, for the legionaries, to sort of understand the thrust of your project? Because it seems like you're saying, okay, we need some technology. It's just, how much and how do you let it control you, or do you have control over it, so to speak?
Sure. I mean, this is the question of the right-wing, online movements. Like, well, we see like technology maybe is a problem and maybe it's influencing our behavior. And then a lot of people are saying, well, we have to be accelerationists. We have to command the wave of technology flooding over our people. And it is when we have the power, much as the communists say, once we have the power and the number, then it will bend to our will. And my opinion of that is, well, the organizational property of technology is so vast that technology has actually become autonomous from the machine. To quote Jacques Ellul, that word autonomous, it is beyond physical form. It now primarily functions as an organizational principle in the post-industrial age of technology and beyond, where it is now manipulating people through modifying our behavior to serve the expansion of technology at the detriment to our personal and individual power. So what the technology does is it begins to arrange the world around us so that we serve its expansion more, and we believe genuinely that it is to our benefit, but it is a total reduction of our individual and folk traditional power. You can see this primarily, since you're a more aesthetic channel, the first thing to be deleted by technological organization would be beauty, for example. The second thing would be traditional expressions of ancestral identity, and you would try to have a mass leveling where everything becomes mixed to the lowest possible level so that technology has no longer any barrier to expansion. Its will in itself is to expand as efficiently as possible, and it's modifying human behavior to do so. And therefore, in my suggestion, we need to have a agrarian revival where we focus on making small groups of individuals very powerful and self-sufficient by the means of their own production, rather than being reliant on the consistent expansion of technology. The underpinning narrative of the accelerationist, much like the leftist progressive, is this notion of progress, where we're evolving up time, that we're expanding onward and forever, and it's always a benefit into the future. But if you think of us from a classical Greek perspective, thinking about the pre-Socratic thinkers of Hesiod, I often cite, Hesiod suggests that we are actually, time almost works backwards, where he says it works in 4 ages, where in the beginning of time, we start as the Golden Age, then the Silver Age, then the Iron Age, then the Bronze Age, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got this declining in ages, said the pre-Socratic Greeks. They thought we were going backwards in time, or as we continue to remove ourselves from our traditional hierarchies as Westerners, maybe detachment from our original gods or our original culture, as we move beyond that, we are actually rapidly degenerating. And that's the Evolian perspective of the Kali Yuga, the great decline, the state of infinite decline. But the fun thing about the state of decline is the illusion that we feel like we're going upwards, but all qualities of life are actually going downwards exponentially. And that force in itself of downward movement, I believe, would be considered technology in itself.
It's interesting. And obviously, like I said, those are certain places where we have differing views. But I do agree with you on the idea that technology begins to assemble itself beyond the system. This is something that even some, and I will say there's a few good leftist thinkers out there who contribute to this. One such person is Jean Baudrillard. And I was reading his book, System of Objects. We've covered it a little bit on this channel. And he basically talks about the transition from technology working on behalf of the human subject to eventually sort of becoming its own positive feedback loop. And if you think of the core function of technology and then tie that to capital in general, it would generally be producing capital for the sake of producing more capital. And this is where you start to get into this sort of positive feedback loop and the system autonomously sort of building itself. And to your point, what Baudrillard says is our desires begin as us using technology to fulfill our desires, but over time you start to get these very unnatural desires that derive from capitalism or technology more generally. And I think it's to your point that it is something to consider living in a very technologically heavy modern capitalist system, that you're going to start to have your psychology reworked and reprogrammed based on a lot of these sort of artificial desires that are given to you. And I think this is largely why you see a lot of people today, they're looking at progress and they're looking at utility. They're looking at this idea that, okay, as long as we have enough comfort, enough pleasure, things are going to be all right. And we see people turning to maybe what you're doing, so going to a more authentic mode of being, mode of living, and saying, okay, we've lost something in modernity. We've lost something due to capitalism and technology proliferating itself in this way that sort of takes away our identity. And to your point, sort of brings us down to the lowest common denominator, because within capitalism, and this is something even leftist thinkers talk about, and for them, it's to your point where they're kind of seeing this as a positive of saying, okay, over time, we're going to get rid of all this difference. And you and I, of course, would affirm positive difference as essential to the human character. And a lot of these leftist thinkers would kind of have this accelerationist position where they're saying, well, capitalism essentially excises all that traditional identity, all that historical identity, and that mode of being that is built through hundreds or thousands of years of a shared past, a shared ethos, and a spatiality in the world. Because to the idea of the nomad, just by being in the steppes, that's going to change your entire perception of how you feel about the world. Or you look at the Chinese have a very communal mode of being because they've been living in these tiny, cramped cities for thousands of years. And that could actually be detrimental to your psyche as well. And what I wanted to ask you, because we're talking about a mode of being, a mythos, and I was reading that document you sent me a while back, and in it, you're really trying to look at and extract the answer of what is the American identity, what is the American mythos. And some of the things that you brought up in there were the frontiersmen, you brought up manifest destiny. So I guess my question is, with America sort of being around for the past 300 years, not having those thousands of years of history that maybe many European peoples do or many Asian peoples do, what is the American identity, and what's the solution in modernity where there doesn't seem to be a clear American identity being promoted?
Sure. Well, we've got, there's so many pathways we can go to. Do we want the Evolian extremist? Do we want the Ted Kaczynskian extremist? Do we want me? Ooh, what are we going to do here? So we've got a couple of terms. I wanted to introduce you to a memeified version of something that you reference a lot, this technological organizational principle. I think a good way to phrase technology, because again, I'm not actually anyway, describing the machine of technology. We're communicating through a machine. No one cares. Okay. We're thinking about the organizational principle of technology. I refer to that myself as progress. And you could think about this as the idea of technological possession. So you're going to add Jung into this. He talks about ideological or shadow possession. And much like the man who it is unknown to him that he is shadow possessed, we are unknown to the fact that technology is secretly moving us through the world. Technological possession, that our attitudes are being changed given the nature of our environments and giving nature to the dependency that we have on the machine. You can see this in example with let's say the transgender gentleman. This individual represents the pinnacle of human weakness, of which if the technology was not there to support him, this would be the guy we'd be shoving him in lockers all the time. We would be beating the piss out of him. We would be destroying this person. He's at the lowest possible level in the social hierarchy. And so he must serve technology as the only access to power. And he must expand the technological will. The benefit that he gets is he makes other people around him very weak. This might be what Nietzsche is also talking about. What I identify as technological possession, changing attitudes, that might be Nietzsche's idea of transvaluation, where we're actually inverting our values due to our sedentary lives and our subservience to the machine, where all of the great men in human history and in current days are being wiped out of existence and replaced with the sort of transgender man with no identity, with no ancestral being, with no orientation other than to rationalize the decline as his very being in itself. And the American has a very specific way of dealing with modernity, where he says, first starting out in his European form, he says, I don't believe in this modern experiment. This thing that we call progressive, we're not going upwards, we're going downwards. We don't want to live in this confined sedentary existence, this pathetic suburbanized or urbanized condition of the Europeans. We don't do that. We have this deep Indo-Aryan ancestry that we have maintained for generations. We need to reignite that by throwing ourselves off into the wilderness. And it was this the word manifest destiny that encapsulates that phrase. It's a revival of the destiny of the European folk, which correctly is a continuation of that original, authentic nomadic spirit, where he takes the form now of a frontiersman. He's integrating himself with nature, and he's also learning from the Indians, the tribes that are already there, how to more properly function within nature to optimize his existence in alignment toward God. In this case, it would be alignment with whatever radical Christian orientation that the American settler would have identified by. And he's moving into folk settlements where if you're a Puritan, if you're a Quaker, if you're a Mennonite, you're moving into these different folk movements who can now maintain self-sufficiency beyond a total possession of the modern world. He's actually rejecting the modern world in the Evolian sense, and he's sort of making his own pathway. He's adopting the heroic ideal of self-sufficiency predicated upon his agrarian needs. Now, in this context, we're thinking about the American as someone who is self-sufficient because of his virtue with hunting, and we're thinking about him as self-sufficient in the sense that he is so powerful, he can leave the technological system, he can leave the modern system because he has skills that have maintained in his bloodline. And he also has a community of individuals who think the same in these various communities. And these communities, now being self-sufficient from the modern system, they can begin to trade and connect with each other to further improve the goods that they're making or further improve their knowledge, and we can then expand and conquer the nation. So that's a very quick definition of the American, encapsulated our 400 years of history there, but essentially reviving that practice where, in my view, we can have this international network of people who are living in low-tech versions of civilization and are kind of crafting our own nations within a nation or civilizations within a civilization and creating a kind of network of full communities who can trade products with each other is something I think would be considered the revolution in itself. And the ideal version of the revolution would be someone like the Amish or the Mennonites, who are so powerful that they only need their own land. And through the monetization of their own land, they can be almost entirely removed from all modern issues or modern poisons.
I guess one thing that I would sort of derive from that is like in the case of the Mennonite. See, I'd say that my project is definitely a cosmopolitan in the sense that I do sort of see, the sort of thing that Lance and I talk about is we have to join three letter agencies, join the military, go to college, get high positions. Because I think on some level, in terms of power geopolitically, you need an armed forces. You need to be able to produce military arms, all these sort of things to continue in the race for power. So I wonder if, in your vision, is it everybody that necessarily has to, I guess, return to the land, so to speak, and live this more, this sort of more, I guess, nomadic lifestyle, or on some level, given because we brought up China just a second ago, and China, for instance, has totally instrumentalized every single member of their society to serve this sort of the will to power of the PRC, for instance, right? So on some level, if we take like the Mennonite who doesn't engage in modern life, he doesn't serve in the military generally. Their existence kind of depends, right, on the American government. So I'm curious, do you think that in terms of the way that a population is oriented and structured, that there still needs to be some element of it that engages in a cosmopolitan life and an industrial life to sort of continue on the instrument of power geopolitically?
Sure, I get that. The comment I get the most often, which I'm not saying this, I'm not making this as a hyperbole. I mean, this is the literal comment that I am gifted, which is constantly, if you're going to be Amish, if you're going to make a farm, you're going to get drone strike. The Jews are going to drone strike you from Israel, and they're going to stop any kind of movement that you have. And I wake up this morning, and Dubai, of all places, is being drone striked. Another city. Oh, my goodness. So it seems to me the city folk are the only people that are getting drone striked, interestingly enough. Now, that's just kind of a joke about my general time on X.com, for example. But what we think about the Amish, do they need authentic protection? And let's think about this logically. So let's say in the 1980s, as an exact example, the Amish living in Pennsylvania, they thought credit card processors, who needs them? Digital currency? That's disgusting. Credit cards? Gross. We're not going to do that. We're not even going to be around these people. They're too modern. And they were looking for options. What do I do? And the government of Belize at the time was offering, they said, hey, if you guys want to come down here and you want to take to our frontier land over off into the jungle and you want to go and colonize that by yourself, we'll give you citizenship. And they said, I'll take it. So a group of Amish Mennonites came into to Belize in the 1980s and they built a civilization. And that civilization was very successful up until 2017, when they said these people are getting a little bit too modern and progressive around us again, those ugly Belize folk. I think we're going to go to the Amazon rainforest because no one will ever go to the Amazon. And a group in 2017 went off to the Amazon rainforest, and now they're beginning to colonize the Amazon rainforest again. And I'm sure in the Amazon, they're going to be doing all kinds of feuds with the different tribes, contacted and uncontacted, that are there. And we're going to get to see, well, do they actually need the protection? Or in this case, are they nonviolent on paper, but when they actually have a genuine threat and no one's around to see it, would they actually then be more aggressive? So what I'd like to do is take a camera equipment down there and develop the first trade route to go into these Amish Mennonite civilizations in the Peruvian Amazon, probably next year. And we'll see what their answer is, and we'll see what they've built there. And we'll bring that information back to the Western folk, and we'll know what's possible then. We just have to get the example first.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to look at. And one of the things that you brought up reminded me of what Nick Land talks about in terms of hyperstition and Lemurian time war, where you talked about, of course, going back to the sort of self-assemblage of technology over time. There's something that Nick Land talks about where he says, and I'm going to very briefly summate it, so it's not going to be super in depth. But he talks about this concept of Lemurian time war, and the joke is that lemurs in Madagascar are part of this this sort of otherworldly beings that are manipulating the present through the past to assemble itself. But conceptually, memeing aside, conceptually, what he's trying to illustrate is that technology begins to sort of develop a libidinal will. So maybe not necessarily a will in the sense that you and I have one, but that there's certain key properties intrinsic to the way that capital necessarily needs to assemble itself, that it pushes towards a specific direction. So it's interesting talking about technology and talking about the different ways that human types respond to technology and seeing whether they'll be successful or not over time. But what I wanted to talk about, which I think is interesting, and I'm sure you have a critique of this statement, but going back to Jean Baudrillard, one of his critiques of tribalistic societies, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, is he says that because fundamentally any tribal society that exists because the homogenous society allows them to exist, it sort of becomes a simulation. So he uses this I don't know if you'd call it a thought experiment, or I believe this might have actually happened, where there was this primitive tribe in some jungle somewhere in the world, and these modern people, they came and they took them out of the jungle, and of course they all started dying of smallpox or diseases and so on and so forth. So they put them back into the jungle. Baudrillard's argument would be, once you put them back in the jungle, they've become a simulation, which is still part of the larger system of capitalism and technology, because they're allowed to exist by the capitalists and the technologists, the people with power. So I'm curious, because I'm sure you have a critique of this argument from Baudrillard. What would you say in response to him saying that trying to live the Luddite life, or trying to move back from modern life because at a certain level you're allowed to do it because some government allows you to, like in the case of Blees, right? Like they invited them in. What would you be your contention to that, and saying that this is not just a simulation, that it is truly escaping from the sort of technological system of objects, so to speak?
Sure. But if I was to respond to that, I would actually have to write an essay about it, because I haven't thought about it before, and this would be stupid to critique something that I'm unfamiliar with, just in general. My knowledge does not expand that far, and it sounds very complicated. I asked this. My Vietnamese actually approached me when I was living in the jungle in December. They said, hey, we saw these guys in America who are trying to go back to their ancestral traditions, and we had some critiques. Do you know them? And at the same time that I was speaking to the Vietnamese, I got a message from Return to the Land that I was responding to on my laptop. They said, yeah, them. And I said, you know who Return to the Land is? They're like, yeah, we have some problems with them. Can you talk to them for me? I was like, the synchronicity is too strong. What is happening here? So the Vietnamese tribes, who do not really identify as Vietnamese, they speak Vietnamese almost as a third language after English. The tribe I'm living with, the Kahal, had suggested that it is more suitable to work in tandem with the government than to simply remain like uncontacted, for example. So with them, I would probably be able to best figure out this question of if it is even suitable to work with a government body. Now, I'm thinking not in terms of power politically. Political power seems to me to be an illusion that would eventually lead to subservience of perhaps Israel, and consistent warfare of in service to their god of Baal. I might make that claim. Instead, I would suggest that personal power is the ability to remain as self-sufficient as possible, as the Americans once had with their frontier mythos, reclaiming that as a core necessity, not just because it is our authentic and traditional folk practice, but because it is correct to do. And people are doing this globally. And you can make agrarian trade routes very profitable even now. But this concept that we have of the need to continue the modern experiment, where we're constantly sending our children to conscriptive educational systems, and we're constantly subservient to whatever food is in the grocery store that can be easily poisoned with different chemicals. This false type of world seems to me more a simulation, and moving and reorienting ourselves toward this more wild sort of spirit seems to me to be more conducive with the human experience. Like we frame the illusion as reality and reality as an illusion because our values are inverted. So perhaps Evola might say. So very clearly, I don't have an answer to your question. I need to think more about it. Maybe you can send me the book later and I'll write something on it and get back to you.
Absolutely. And one thing that I would say would be my sort of synthesis of this problem would be kind of Nietzschean as well, because I forget which book it is specifically, but Nietzsche says essentially that there necessarily has to be a slave caste in societies, that not everyone can be free. And this is where he gets the pathos of distance, essentially, that the sort of master has a certain elevation over the slave, but that the master and the slave both exist in tandem in a society. And I think one question I would have for you is if you maybe would see this as a potential synthesis, because my view personally would be that the effect of certain political programs, especially on the right, and cosmopolitan programs for that matter, what they attempt to do is they attempt to take the heterogeneous elements of society. So those are the people that don't quite fit in. We don't quite fit in because we want to live in a way, in a manner that modern life doesn't really want us to. We have different views, we have different values, and I would kind of classify them as a sort of master morality in the Nietzschean sense. But fundamental to human history is we see that these master classes have always, in some way or another, depended upon a slave caste to perform labor, to allow the master class to have the idleness necessary to pursue philosophy, arts, sciences, what have you. We see this in ancient Athens. We see this in ancient Sparta. Granted, they were more a military society, right? So they used the helots so that they could pursue the military arts. But I guess my question to you would be, is do you see a potential synthesis in where we retain cosmopolitan society so that we can continue producing, for example, weapons to sustain a nation? And I know you have, let's say, suspicion about political power, but I guess what I would say we ought to do is I would say we ought to have, until we can replace the slave caste with automation, which you probably don't like, but this is kind of my future. Until that point, the purpose of people like us is to elevate ourselves to the elite, and we can live the more nomadic lifestyle. We can live outside the cities and estates. We can eat freshly grown food. We can grow our own food. But then simultaneously, we retain a large labor caste so that we can continue the production necessary to effectively combat peripheral states like China, for instance, to be able to engage in these global conflicts, which over time we could easily see that if a new hegemon were to arise, we might not be able to have the privilege of being able to sustain ourselves off of the land, because we still need to control that land through means of power in the first place. So I would say, do you think that there's any synthesis where we, people like you and I, can subsist by still engaging in the political process, but putting ourselves at the top and sort of allowing the more petty means of life that sort of degrade you to a lower caste of people, so to speak?
Okay, I think the ideas that I have established that would best relate to your topic are the silent revolution as defined by Evola and what that looks like, and then the summoning of Wotan. I know those are pretty. I just want to introduce you to because we're going to get a little bit esoteric now. Okay, these answers will not properly again identify your question, but I've written about them before, so I'm able to speak about them in this context. Now, Evola suggests very directly. He says we are to have a silent revolution of which we are basically rebelling against the current structure. We define the structure not as civilization, but as anti-civilization. That is antithetical. It is the opposite, what we currently live as, the opposite of the traditional realm of an Aryan hierarchy. So even if you were to attain power or status in this world, it would not only be illusionary, but it would also be self-destructive to you and destructive to the civilization itself. It needs to be a total rejection. And so when I am speaking and developing a philosophy, it is not for everyone. It is for like 10 people who are capable enough to organize in a group, and they require an orientation that is in an agrarian focus. I understand that you and Lance, a very good friend of mine, would love to take over a 3-letter agency and have this kind of mass movement. But we've seen with the election of Donald Trump, for example, that this person has essentially, all of the political forces are betraying us. You could say that they are subservient to Israel. You are, if I want to be a Kaczynskian, I would suggest that the political systems are both technologically possessed and are working on to the benefit of technology, which the result would always be this consistent mixing and the destruction of the American identity by giving him the promotion of different surrogate activities. But in my view, we are not seeking power, and we are moving more toward the accumulation of folk power. So we don't need political power. It's defined as something antithetical to the European, and instead we're moving into folk communities. Now, across time, the folk community could amass genuine power, but we're so weak and we're so disenfranchised and we're so disunified, and we fight all the time, even on the right, constantly bickering. It annoys me. But what we can do is we can say this is a generational revolution where, okay, if we agree that behavior is being modified by living in the pods, which is the apartment, and we agree that behavior is being modified even as something as small, as you said in one of your videos, as constantly touching concrete with our feet rather than grass. Well, we need to get a fortress together so that we can raise generations beyond that anti-civilization and begin to have a completely and birth a completely different orientation, which across time, if successful, maybe could then generate a type of a political movement as well. But at the current level that we operate on, still going to the grocery store to eat the chemical food. We pick up a piece of bread. What is the quality of the bread? We call it bread, just like we call civilization. But when you look at the ingredients of the bread, the white bread, you can see it's just a variety of chemicals. It gives you the taste of bread, but it is not in itself the same bread as we would have had in Roman times, just as our civilization now is not the same as it ancestrally was. And what we're going to do when we consistently pursue political power as the only means, which, by the way, is the same argument the communists make, if only I had power, I would reorient civilization to the solar maximum and the heroic ideal. If we all were just communists together. Well, the communists and the conservatives, we're still going to have a central bank at the end of the day. And that central bank is going to be able to produce an infinite amount of dollars. And it's going to even manipulate the fabric of what we've defined as capital in and of itself. So whatever it is, the conservatives and the communists seem to have the same general atmosphere to their ideas, but nothing as a third option, so to speak. And when we're thinking about the political, you can see that the individuals who are the most right, allegedly the most right, would be Trump, the number one Israeli president we've had of all time. Wonderful. So completely in service to each of his policies to a foreign group of individuals. And we can see that our taxes are being increased to continuously fund foreigners. And the foreigners that are invading our country are not only allowed to stay, they are championed to stay. And that those foreigners continue to bring down the quality of perhaps the old Virginian aristocracy of warriors. That's being degraded now too. And the warrior almost has even less of a place than he had in the American identity. And if we're going to put somebody in charge again, it's going to be another false idol like Trump. But what are we doing with Trump? We're projecting onto him this European spirit. We're suggesting almost in a way that he is this great savior, this heralded massive being. And we're almost worshiping him like an ancient type of God, where you have the worshiper occultists of the boomer conservative, and you have the enemy of that cult being something like a leftist. There's a lot of psychic energy felt around him. And it seems as though the American is, in a sense, from Jung's paper on Wotan, it seems like the Western European is trying to summon that warlord again. I think that's actually what you and I are both doing. We're summoning that Paul of Dune-esque figure, that Wotanic ideal in the form of the man. We're looking to make a kind of great man to get us out of whatever predicament that we're in. And we're hoping that a great man can reorder civilization from his exceptional qualities and his virtuous qualities that he has. And I think the production of this great man is going in a traditional orientation that is one who is in total rejection of all elements of the modern civilization. If we can get individuals who are raised in this kind of low-tech world or this realm where they're very integrated with their folk and folk conscious of the maintenance of traditions, we can get individuals who are produced that are the embodiment of those traditions and are so strong, then they can begin to rewrite reality in accordance with their will. And we can see the ideal of the Evolian hero being the Amish in this case, because the Amish are basically so strong that they've maintained their original German language, even moving into Peru. The only book that they read, or at least, again, thinking about the Peruvian settlements, still they are guided only by the Bible, by their own will and choice. And from the American perspective, you could think of it as instead, it is not we who are protecting and serving them. It is them who are protecting and serving us, because we have to remember the Amish are also exempt from military service. They're one of the only groups that can actually get out of taxes. The American is taxed internationally 15.3% on his business. If he has a business, an LLC, or he's self-employed, he always has to pay Medicare and Medicaid. But because their full community is so strong, they're the only group that's able to get out of this with a religious exemption, the same with vaccines. So it's almost like the Amish are so virtuous that they can get out of all of these little traps in our anti-civilization. And if we made more groups that had that focus, eventually, maybe in the third or fourth generation, we can move into taking over first a county, well, first an area of land, then a county, then maybe a region, then we can maybe do something national. But it always comes back to that Evolian silent revolution, where we're rejecting the modern in itself as decadent, and we're trying to establish ourselves in a new orientation. And we're trying to figure out what that orientation is. And as Americans, the answer always goes back to the rebirth of the frontiersman.
You know, on the topic of Donald Trump, I would say that there are very clearly positives that you can observe with him. For example, I don't think that if Kamala Harris won, you'd be able to have all these people on the dissident right being able to say what they are. And on the topic of Israel, I think that largely under the Trump administration, you've seen more people speaking out against Israel than any other time in American history. So while he himself is far from perfect, and don't get me wrong, I think that just the idea that so many people hate him, so many people in the political establishment hate him, and this is true, by the way, because if you look at the quote deep state security apparatus that was established with Truman back, I believe, I want to say 45 or 46, back when the Central Intelligence Agency was founded and all these different things, we've largely seen that regardless of who's in power in the executive branch, so that regardless of who the president is, whether that's on the left or the right, with a couple of exceptions, maybe Kennedy was one of those exceptions, that generally speaking, the deep state security apparatus has been pretty much the same from Truman to Obama. And what that illustrates to me is that it doesn't really matter who's in charge, that fundamentally the people who move the wheels of power in American politics don't change. However, for the first time in American history since Truman, and then maybe JFK, Trump really did sort of discombobulate that structure, that deep state security apparatus structure. So while it's true that Trump himself is very far from perfect, and probably he has lots of foreign interests that work with him. I mean, obviously AIPAC, I think, has about 90% of Congress and the Senate. But what I've seen and what I've witnessed personally is, one, that there is more speech for people on our side to be able to talk about these more dissident things, to talk about things more extreme than Trump, right? I think that's been allowed under the Trump administration more so than any other presidency. I mean, we've reached the first net zero immigration for the first time in I don't know how long. The border, while deportations could be way up, I think the border security has been a very big positive in the Trump administration. And the last thing I'll say on Trump is that I don't think anyone sees him as an end. What we do see is that gradual progression to something more dissident, whether that be your project or my project. Because do you think Return to the Land would be allowed under a Newsom presidency or a Kamala Harris presidency? You know what I mean? So while he's imperfect, I think he opens up the door for more extreme, more radical solutions to I guess, come into being over time. So that'd be just my brief thing about why I think that regardless of Trump clearly being imperfect, there are a lot of positives that come out of his presidency, and it's not quite the same as just any other person getting elected. So that'd be my thing. But to build further on what you sort of were talking about regarding Evola and why I sort of, obviously prescriptively in terms of the aesthetics that Evola talks about, I mean, I love them. I think they're very beautiful. Reading the society that he envisions from an aesthetic standpoint is very beautiful. But we also have to remember, even with Evola, he wants to build an imperium, right? He wants to build something resembling Rome. And it's very important that his access of the European character was not the Nordic Germans necessarily. It was more so Roman society, which was cosmopolitan, which was structured around a folk centered in these more condensed forms of living, which again, I think sort of illustrates the elite class existing in tandem with the lower caste. But what I do totally agree with you with is the idea of creating a consciousness that isn't subverted by modern life. I think that is very important. And then the question becomes, how do you do that? And I think at the very least, sending your child to a public school is probably a death sentence at this point. So I think like the whole homeschooling project that you see in projects like Return to the Land, I think that's a good thing. I think that probably you have to get your kids off of social media and all these things that sort of slowly degrade their I guess spiritual content of their character over time. It's just slowly degraded by all these things. They're ensconced in modern capitalism and technology, et cetera, et cetera. But when we talk about manifesting this figure who represents this more authentic mode of being or mode of living, what I would slightly push back in is taking the more Nietzschean approach, where the Nietzschean project is obviously not a return. Evola's is a return. But the Nietzschean project isn't a return. It's a transitionary phase to something that is in many ways post-human. I mean, over man, it has the signifier man, but in over, it's saying that it's something that is either spiritually or biologically distinct from man. And I think what's different from the appropriation of technology by the left, to your point about the troon, so to speak, who doesn't want to have an identity, who's sort of coping for his desire not to have identity, or maybe just coping for the loss of identity. And one of the things I like to point out is the difference between and maybe you'd be against both these things, but the difference between the transgender and then Uber Boyo. Are you familiar with Uber Boyo? You see my videos with him. We sort of it was kind of jokingly, we were talking about like the looks maxer, for example, as this idea, maybe not a perfect idea, but of somebody who's using these different tools available to him in modernity to seek a higher ideal. So I think that for me, the Nietzschean project sort of posits that you do have to go forward. The only way is forward. There is no return. There is no sort of golden age that we can return to. We can only go forward through this malaise, and that requires using all the instruments and tools available to us to reach that something more that exists at the end of the bridge. But my question to you would be regarding this sort of thrust to create an alternative consciousness. Do you think we have enough time to reach that point? Because the way that I'm seeing technology develop, I could see us probably having something approximating consciousness. I actually don't think that artificial intelligence can be conscious the way that it exists now, but something approximating an intelligence that replicates consciousness and then the singularity that comes out of that. Do you see there being enough time to create this consciousness, this folk consciousness that could eventually have power in such an accelerated timeline where all these forces of capital and technology are just rapidly progressing towards something inhuman that we may not have the ability to fight against?
I see nothing more heroic than an organized group of men directly combating the modern world through an ascetic warrior ritual rite where they are completely developing their own sort of civilization within a civilization in accordance with their own will. I think that's the most Nietzschean thing that you can do, is find this anti-civilization, as Evola says, and directly fight it with everything you have. Now, that might take you to some weird places. That's taken me to live with Vietnamese tribal people, and it's taken me to live with the Armenian Mullahs, and it's taken me to live with Kyrgyz nomads, and now I'm building millions of dollars in agrarian investments into Kyrgyzstan, and I'm making the local people extraordinarily wealthy with Western trade routes, right? It's this weird adventure. So when we see my movement, we are fundamentally a philosophy of action. We are not static conservatives who are going to be every man having a podcast in his basement, a monetized online persona who just says the same words. I'm sure that you've had this too, where you've been in an interview with someone and you say the same talking points, and then you go to the next interview and you say the same talking points again, and the third interview you say the same talking points again, because you're friends with these people, so you want to always have positive relationships. And then, is that the movement? We just say the same word. So if I say the magical word remigration, I click my heels like Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz, remigration, come down upon me, right? Are we just going to be conservatives who are saying magical words that have been provided to us by politicians, or are we genuinely going to form a new and unique orientation? We could talk about regaining political positions of power every day. That's what everyone does. We all want positions of power somewhere in the civilization. I have my position of power as an academic and as somebody who serves trade with all these different countries, for example. So I'm in that position as well, and perhaps I could be said I have a fair deal of power, more so than the common man, but I don't care about this thing at all because it's too normy. It's two things that people have done before, many words that people have said before. We need a totally new direction. And this approach, the heroic, it's an adventurous pursuit. For example, if I had my way where I could click my magical fingers and I could do something, what would my something be that would be a little bit different than maybe others' perspective, but yet still grounded in that heroic force? I would take the dissident members of the Americans and the former French Empire, the former British Empire, the former German empires, and I would take particularly the members of the old Soviet Empire, the USSR. I would take all those dissident groups together. I would send them to South America, and I would do as the Amish did, or the Mennonites in this example, or even the Confederate generals who lost in the war, in the American Confederacy War. I would build our own settlement, which is the recollection of all these different Aryan groups, building our own settlement and trying to reorient ourselves toward the cultivation of power from within that settlement to then make a nation. Now, what does that mean? The Mennonites did this in Bolivia, where enough Mennonites moved into Bolivia, where they're now ethnically replacing the native Bolivians there, and they're going to have a higher number of population than Bolivians. So what if we could do that too, where we started it out just as the Confederates did? They said, hey, we lost the American War. Those Northerners, those Yanks, they beat us. What can we do? And at the time, somebody from Brazil, their king, I guess maybe they had at that time, they said, hey, we love what you guys were doing there. Your ability to command agricultural profit, we just thought was the coolest thing. And, if you want to come down here and start your own settlement, we'll give you some land for it. And the Confederates, some of them said, great, sure. And there's a Confederate little settlement out in Brazil. There's a bunch of little German settlements all over South America from after World War II. And we can start like that. We can just find new frontier land, as the American ritual right does. We say, modernity hasn't worked out. We secede. We give up. But in the Mongolian sense, we don't have an idea of giving up. We have a feigned retreat. It looks like we're retreating, but we're actually revitalizing ourselves to where we are not under the radar of a three-letter agency. Now we're a non-peaceful, non-violent group who's living in the mountains of Chile. And we're gathering allies up to where that little settlement in Chile now can eventually, across time, as the Amish have given us the example in Bolivia, totally take over an entire nation. And that would be, I would say, the best thing that I could hope for is these settlements, we start small, and then we can begin to develop them into a beyond civilization that reorients ourselves toward that traditional expression of our identity, toward a new ancient Rome. Hence why my philosophy is formerly known as Mennonite Imperialism. We're trying to reinvent the imperium, but in some strange ways that you might not have thought about before.
No, yeah, totally. I guess just my fear would be that because technology is advancing so fast that there could reach a point where the state eventually says, like Ruby Ridge style, we're just going to go in there. We're going to domesticate everybody who's not part of the homogenous. And to me, I think that what I would argue is that we also need some sort of institutional presence. I mean, I think Arvol has talked about this in terms of Return of the Land. He says our intention is not just to live outside of society, it's to send them back into society once they've been educated, to send them to places like Harvard, to send them to universities like Yale, and then essentially saying, okay, we're going to develop a consciousness outside of the cosmopolitan, but then we're going to send them back into the cosmopolitan to start to sort of assert our power within it. And my fear, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, is how, because I think that it's very, very likely that we're going to reach the point soon that all these people that are involved in the technological or process of capital are going to have so much power, right? And if they have that power and they're in positions of power institutionally, that they're not going to allow these alternative societies to exist, that they're going to Ruby Ridge them, right? That's my fear. And why I used to definitely be more on the alternative community side, but then I had this sort of epiphany where I thought to myself, well, what allows those communities to exist, right? What allows those communities to be able to effectively maintain and sustain these projects, which are necessary, I think, in terms of psychologically and spiritually to reinvigorate a new consciousness. That's the word I keep using, right? Because you want a consciousness that is distinct and not derivative from the system of objects of technology. That's what we're trying to escape. Because for me, and this might be one area where we disagree, but for me, the issue isn't so much of technology and capitalism itself, but the fact that technology and capitalism have escaped control of the human subject. The human subject doesn't control it anymore. And I know you've said, well, it's kind of an illusion that we can regain that control. And then I would say, that is kind of my purpose. And certain political projects that we won't talk about right now and certain ideologies, I think effectively attempt to do that and effectively attempt to reinvigorate and reassert a symbolic value. Because I think that's the most important thing. And I guess one area where we slightly disagree is that, and I talked about this before with similar, like for example, Kevin Deanna is a big fan of Evola. And to me, somebody like Evola, I treat it more conceptually, whereas I treat the transcendent and the metaphysical as something that man necessarily has a role in bringing into being. So to me, it's less so about bringing this primordial force into existence, but this emergent force that requires the human subject. And then the human subject has a role in shaping that force. But fundamentally, it's symbolic value. That's what distinguishes someone like me and you from the capitalist project or modern life in general, is that they deal in utility. They deal in the instrumentalization of the economy to produce the most amount of goods, to produce the most amount of comfort, to accrue capital for the sake of accruing more capital. There's no desire for any sort of transcendent project or transcendent aim. They don't care about anything beyond what is productive. And that's what makes them the homogenous of society. And people like you and I, being the heterogeneous, those on the outskirts of society, we want to strive for an identity that doesn't have a clear productive value. It is something that is rooted in the symbolism of a different way of life that isn't necessarily the most comfortable, isn't necessarily the most pleasurable. It is one that infuses potentially unnecessary struggle into our lives, because of course we could just live the bugman lifestyle. We could hook ourselves up to the goon cave and just, live this sort of pathetic life. There's nothing that says we need to struggle, but we're actively choosing to struggle anyway, because we know in our hearts that there's something more vital in that. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is, I have a fear that we're going to reach a point soon where if you don't control the means of power, power is not going to allow those heterogeneous communities on the outskirts to exist, and they're going to Ruby Ridge us. That's my fear, and that's why I think we need political power. And I'm curious if you see a solution to avoiding getting Ruby Ridge, to avoid these very dark people slowly just subsuming any sort of rebellion against them, because those small communities aren't part of the political process and don't have political power and don't have the ability to resist them. Like, do you see that as a potential thing that could happen?
Right. So for me, I mean, I'm openly apolitical. I think it's such a far removed illusion; it doesn't matter. So I speak primarily in myths, and when I'm thinking of the idea of the political in itself, if it is something that doesn't exist or can't exist, it doesn't even matter if I speak on it. It doesn't matter if we have a disagreement. We're talking about a mirage in the distance, and when we're riding horses in the desert of Turkmenistan, and say, well, that mirage looks like an oasis. And I said, no, it looks more like a castle to me. And then somebody else might say, no, it looks like a grand Germanic forest. It doesn't matter. It's always a mirage. So I don't care about these things. And like, as a result, I think somehow I would be actually a very good candidate to work with multiple governments, because I think my horseback riding in just Kyrgyzstan, this business, brings over $100,000 a month into a rural economy that could never have that level of production. And I can build that as far as Turkmenistan, and I'm going to do that as well, which is going to be fun to see if I actually survive that. Hello, government of Turkmenistan. Thank you very kindly for leading me in here. Can I bring 40 people a month to ride horses through your desert? Right? Like, I'm negotiating these type of deals. So me not being political at all has somehow garnered me into this weird political movement. I just want to ride horses and be American, but I somehow stumbled on my opposite. I think that's a very Nietzschean principle, the idea of going up to go down. The idea of transcendence comes in Jung's sense when we look to our deepest depths of our being. And it is only when we're at the most darkest can we find the lightest ideal within ourselves. So the heroic comes through strife and struggling. And the average American, I'm trying to think about, what can I do that wakes them up from their staticism? What can I do that wakes them up from his poisoned, sedentary, miserable life? And how can I build myself and be a conduit myself for that tradition? You might say, and I think most of the right-wing gentlemen would love to be doing something that I'm doing, but they have this horrible fear that the Chinese are going to drone strike them out of existence. Well, we can just say, what's Rogue doing? Yes, living on the border of China for 10 years and investing millions of dollars on the border of China. Wonderful. Does his country even have a military? No, they do not. They use planes with propellers on them. Excellent. Wonderful. So I can say, well, if I can do this on the border of China and I'm not going to get drone striked, and the local government's very happy with me investing all of this money into them, and they'll leave me alone because I'm advocating for an authentic return and a monetized, profitable revival of their actual authentic folk traditions. Well, I just did that. So I have to be the example in myself. That's the project. We can't just have these Evolian notions of how to live, or as philosophers, we can be the basement academics. We need to be around the people, so to speak. We need to be sharing and teaching ideas, which is why I do no research. I only work with students, and also why I have this project on X where I can just show you, hey, here's the things that I'm doing. Here's the documentary on the Amish I'm going to make next year, and here's Turkmenistan, and here's an alternative perspective here and there and there. And this is another way that civilization can look like, rather than the anti-civilization that we have here. So I'm hoping to be the conduit of the philosophy in itself, and then you can just see the example with your eyes. Or I'll get imprisoned in Turkmenistan next month and I'll just die, and then everything I said is wrong. So we'll see.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, it is really crazy that much what do you call it? I mean, through bringing those, I didn't realize the expeditions brought in that much for the local economies, which is really interesting, and I'm sure that they're very happy about that. And even then, my sort of thing that I would say is, I guess the main thrust is I would say we need both the nomadic lifestyle and the cosmopolitan lifestyle. We need both of what you're doing, and then like people on the ground, because the way I see it is even with these expeditions, right? Like these people are making their money in a cosmopolitan setting, and they're bringing it back to the nomadic peoples and sharing that wealth. So I guess what I would say is I still think that there's a necessary in tandem of those two sides sort of feeding into each other, right? And at a certain level, I think that the nomadic alternative communities can benefit from having some sort of presence in the cosmopolitan. And I think that both of them can exist symbiotically and to each other's benefit. Like, for example, the institutions that I would like to, you could say the political is a mirage, right? But I think on some level, we have to look at the consequences of the political. And what I would argue is that it would be best and most effective if, for example, you were operating these expeditions, right? And you were bringing people to that authentic mode of being, that authentic experience of blood memory, so to speak. I remember when I was in the military, I did a short deployment in the Pacific. And of course, from both my European and Asian side, I have a lot of different seafaring peoples that make up my genetic past. I just remember, I don't know if blood memories are real, but I'm going to say they're real because it felt real. I was just looking at the ocean from this boat that I was on, and I just felt that. I felt that blood memory. And in the way that you probably feel most affirmed riding horses, and I'm sure I would too, but I felt that on the sea. I mean, that was some of the best moments of my life, were being out in the ocean, on the sea, just nothing for miles, the only boat. Sunsets and sunrises on the boat were amazing, right? So I believe in blood memories. But I think, what I would say is the most symbiotic relationship and the way that we can really move forward with this sort of broad movement, because I totally agree that all this infighting, I try to avoid infighting when I can. Obviously, it gets hard. You see some retard that makes a comment, you just feel the need to respond, even though
I don't want to be associated with you fucking losers. Get away from me. Yes, basically. You didn't say the right word. You didn't say the magical word how I want it said. Now we have to kill you.
Yeah,
why?
There's so much of that, reason. Right? Exactly. So
just to stop you here, just so that we can continue to be friends, it is irrelevant whether we have a disagreement, and I mean we as in you and me, and it's relevant with people on the movement. Having this incessant need to say, well, balance is the right answer. Well, I like this idea, but I don't like it. Is irrelevant. We are chain smoking outside on the balcony looking at the sunset. We're having a nice cup of tea down at the coffee plantation. We have to get away from this asinine, consistent, degenerative focus on magical language and the implementation of hypothetical means. We need to be living in real life, out of the basement, out of the monetized podcast, and we need to be mobile. As long as you are mobile in what you're doing, like we keep referencing return to the land because that's the phrase that best encapsulates the words that I'm saying. I have no affiliation with them. We agree when I did their podcast that we are almost like antithetical to our own projects, because I work with the evil third worlders and they work with the illustrious high IQ European people. So we agree that we would like naturally be against each other in the wild, but that's also what the American does, because we have this variation of folk communities. The early Americans loved to hang Quakers. We loved to go and find Quakers in Pennsylvania and hang them from trees. Why? I don't know, but we had this distaste of Quakers, perhaps for being too liberal progressive, just as the Puritans and the Pilgrims have some slight differences, just as the Amish and the Dutch Reformed had differences. That's what the American is. He is a member of a folk community with a slight variation, but the American is always the most extreme version of the ideology. That's maybe what separates us from more of a European. We are only a collective of extremists, and it is perfectly fine if we have disagreements. It's maybe even the root of our traditional orientation is to have disagreements. Do you want to spend years of your life debating on podcasts, or do you want to be moving in person? So I think any traditional orientation that is being revived, as long as it's being lived, is great. Like when I see you and Lance, I'm like, I got to make these guys $1 million. I need to like lock in and find a way to fund these people. I don't want any connection at all with the political, but because they're such upright, and upstanding individuals, I want to fund them. Or when I see Return to the Land, I'm like, we have so many differences. But actually, funny enough, at the end of that conversation, we said, like, maybe we could do like an international trade route together. Or like maybe we could send some of our members to the steppe and you can teach them nomadic husbandry for a summer, like a kids camp for the summertime. Teach them about horses, teach them about agrarian trade, take them through the Silk Road, and have them think from an economic perspective how to monetize our agrarian goods when we get to that level, right? So we're all having these separate settlements, just like we used to in the American context. And the important part is not just that we're discussing, but we're living the orientation, and each member becomes the embodiment, the new era of great men. And we are working together as this era of great men to create that new orientation, whatever that might be.
No, I totally agree with you. And I think that difference is important because what I was going to say is that I think necessarily that symbiotic relationship emerges, like I said, because we may be living the cosmopolitan lifestyle here, but then we can go back and experience that more holistic, mode of life and experience what you're experiencing and live that life of action, so to speak, while also being able to bring in, the economic benefits of being part. In a sense, it's kind of, I think it's necessary in a sense to parasite off of all the systems that are destroying your life anyway and say, okay, if you're going to try to parasitically live off of me, I'm also going to try to steal from you and give it back in a certain sense, right? Like almost paratically. And I think that's important that, for example, in regards to these expeditions that, we may be making money from being part of the modern life, but then we have to take that money, we have to push it back into these more natural things, these more positive things long term. And so I totally agree with you. And I think that if there was a symbiotic relationship to mention in this specific instance is that we get all these people in the West who for most of their life, maybe they're not experiencing what they ought to be experiencing. They're not out on the steppes. They're not getting fresh air and sunlight, and they're not stepping on grass when they wake up in the morning. And that's bad, obviously. But then they can come and they can experience that with you. And then they could bring all this all the sort of, I guess, economic benefits of living in the cosmopolitan society. They could take it from the people we don't want to have it. Because we, frankly, what we totally agree on is that the current political institutions are entirely corrupt. The current elites are incredibly decadent and either need to be eliminated or replaced. We're taking that from them and we're saying, okay, we're going to push this back into positive projects and the good projects that reaffirm this I guess vitality that's largely lost in modernity. So that's just mainly what I'm saying. And the whole Nietzschean thing where we as with a master morality, we have to reappropriate the labor of the slaves and we have to use it positively to fund these sort of things that we want to do.
Whoa, you're going to get me imprisoned by the KGB. That's an inference that I'm using local labor as slave labor. That is incorrect. That is punishable. You want to send me to the KGB office again to get a third interrogation. That was very sneaky there, American CIA operative.
No, we're doing that. We're doing that by being part of the American system. Because I would say that in the nomadic lifestyle, you don't really have a slave caste anyway. Because that's the whole thing when you live in these like smaller tribalistic societies, you don't really have class. You have family ties, kin ties, these sort of things. I think a slave caste necessarily only emerges in sedentary life, in agricultural, and by agricultural life, I mean sedentary agricultural life or industrial life for that matter, right? Where instead of the serf, you get the proletariat. So all I'm mainly saying is that I think it's okay to recognize that not everybody is going to be saved. And I think that's true, absolutely. But that you have to find a way to reappropriate those forces and those resources and those energies to your own ends. And it's a very difficult thing to do, but I think that we can do that and we can find a way to fuel these projects like you have and work symbiotically in a way that everyone is slowly benefiting and we're slowly, the forces vitality are slowly reemerging against, I guess, the forces of restriction and constraint that you see in modernity. But it is interesting. And, you obviously have my full support and I would love to get back, or not back out there. I guess back out there in the blood memory sense, right? We got to go back to we're going to go find the Hapaborean motherland in the steppes of Central Asia, so to speak,
Right. This is the real project, right? I come in, I start making all these countries really wealthy. I unify them under like the ancient ancestral shamanic identity. Then once I get Turkmenistan open the borders, that's our gateway into Europe. So we can take the old nomads and go into Europe and we can cleanse them from all the invaders as a paid mercenary force with millions of nomadic horde raiders going through the city, and then they just leave because they can't live in sedentary life. They're not in that. And the real masters can come back out and reorient the anti-civilization towards its solar heroic era, as it would in the Roman sense, right? This is the real project, right? If I was an idealist, I might say something like that, but of course that would get me in prison, so I can't say that out loud, but I did, and it sounds nice.
Yeah, it'd be like some Dune-esque sort of thing. Instead of the Fremen, you're going under the steppes and you're getting, just imagine a bunch of guys with AKs on horseback, just pop, pop, reaffirming old Mongolian tactics.
Okay, we don't actually use AKs. AKs are still majoritively owned by the Russian population here. We do use Dragunovs. They love like sniper rifles. Like when you go up into the mountains, if you work with the hunters, we hunt normally ibex here in the very high mountains. So these guys are going up with Soviet Union era sniper rifles, and they're stalking ibex for like 10 days on horseback until they can get a good shot, and then they bring that down the mountain to process it later on. But it's these fun experiences that I really like to go on. I think one of my favorite expeditions that I ever did, and this is what the American needs more of. He needs more of that adventure. I'm really trying to find the rarest animal in the entire world now as like an active thing to do. Like that's very American to me, where I'm going into the Vietnamese jungle. I'm doing negotiations with all these different tribal groups. 4 of them are under my command. And we're looking in the jungle. We're trying to track this animal called the Saula, which is a unicorn. It's this giant antelope species that has 2 really long horns that are perfectly parallel. So it looks like one from a side profile. Only one of them has been photographed, I think, in the last just 10 years, right? Like hunting down that animal would be really cool. And you can come with me to do that. Or you can go up with me into the Nomads and we can hunt ibex. And this isn't really like this isn't like a make-believe pretend thing like, oh, my philosophical theory is about like the reclamation of the American frontiersmen, and I'm going to write papers from the ivory tower. It's like we have to like live the thing. I don't understand the internet people who are like, I'm going to tweet on X and get $1,000 in ad revenue every month, and these ideas are going to be really cool and edgy. Well, they're not edgy, and they're manufactured by the technological system. You're repeating the same mantras again and again, and you don't lead people. If your philosophy is not about in the master Nietzschean sense, if you're not physically leading people out into the wilds of the unknown and giving them the lessons with your physical hands in the same space, you have no philosophical ground to stand on. It doesn't matter what your fancy ideal is. In your case, you need to be virtuous in your reality, taking over 3-letter agency. In my case, I need to be leading the 3-letter agency through Nigeria with my tribal contacts to do security for the Christian groups there against the Islamic people that are killing them right now, right? There's a trade negotiation we have. And that's the idea of my version of the right-wing movement, where we have these international people that are trading with each other beyond the standard technological system in itself and beyond the normative system that has been constructed by our anti-civilization satanic leaders. We need to have a totally new way of forming in reality. And what we're doing is we're collecting allies to actually implement that into real life. And we're organizing them together. So again, we can birth that new great hero. And maybe the heroic force will take your and Lance's perspective, and maybe they'll take my perspective, and maybe we'll have multiple great heroic forces. That's the idea of the American.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, I think that it's interesting because there's definitely different archetypes that I suppose identify the American, and some people might choose different paths, but I think what's important fundamentally is that it is a positive path. And well, what is positive? I think positive is reclaiming this vital human essence, which I think is defined first and foremost by discrimination, inequality, and beauty. Because I think beauty, obviously, it's posited on this idea of distinction, discrimination, and inequality. Without inequality, nothing's beautiful, obviously, right? And I think that we're in associating with, I suppose, the more vital dissident right. You're necessarily positing that there is a quality of life that is higher than another form of life, and this is exactly what capitalism as an autonomous force, technology as an autonomous force does. Is it has no necessity for distinction, has no necessity for discrimination, to discriminate between something being higher or lower in terms of human types. And it really leads to this great leveling and this great sameness that I think is kind of the end state of the liberal project. When you think about it, this is true of race, this is true of culture, this is true of religion. I mean, plurality is supposed to result in diversity, but it really doesn't. And I wrote about this in my Hapaborea article, is that, you're not really an Asian in America. You're just part of this leftist blob of different minorities that I think are effectively wielded to attack white interests, for instance, or to attack a positive, quote unquote, right wing identity. So, I think we're largely on the same boat, though through different means. But
Well, let's lock into this the Hapaborean, right? Because
yeah,
I
yeah.
live in the kingdom of Hapaborea, so helping you develop this meme, I would be honored to serve. And let's think about, just as you said, the Asian is not an Asian in the American context because he becomes a POC. He becomes a person of color. Now, this is very interesting for the ethnically diverse fans in your audience who are not of European background, because you can see leftism is your genuine enemy. And it is so obvious as your enemy that it literally deletes your entire ethnic practice to become a mass man, a person of color. And when we say person of color, it means that your culture was once a higher culture, but because it was different, needs to be exhumed. And now you take the culture of the mass. Evola calls this the negrified culture. And he blames Americans for all the evils in the world, which is ironic that I love him so much. But he suggests that when you mix all these people together, they become the lowest form of their being, and they begin to worship the decline as the identity in and of itself. And the tragedy of the Asian ethnic in America is he could very easily be the Mishima type, the one who is so oriented toward the revitalization of his ethnos that he's even termed the honorary Aryan, as we say with the Japanese, right? They are so perfect in the representation of their people that the American has to give him credence and say, well, the Japanese are actually our number one ally. Well, the Japanese are actually Aryan Asians, for example, and that is even as the let's say white nationalist, white supremacist type, we love the individuals who can represent the highest tier of their culture. That's the thing that even the furthest white nationalist enjoys doing. He'd be very happy to have a trade route if he had a country with Japan, just because they represent their being so well. So another facet of the revolution, one could say, is a return or a revitalization, perhaps, of those ethnic expressions of culture. And as you were talking about, the leftist is sort of ensconced, to use the Patrick Saltykov word of praise, the ensconced. The leftist is ensconced in this world where he is consumed by the mass man, and he's beginning to take it in his identity. He's beginning to become nothing, but he could very easily, all it takes is one experience where you're on the ocean as a person of Filipino descent, and you're on the ocean and you see nothing but blue, and you realize, I should conquer Hawaii. I should conquer Hawaii right now for no reason. I should go there and I should make a kingdom for just me for no reason. And you don't know why. So my objective with my expeditions is to wake up these people and to remind them of the other orientation, that there is another option. And that can only come through action and me personally guiding you on this action that's curated in a way that is most optimized to wake you up from this paradigm. And then you can bring that over to the West if you want. You can go be Cosmopolitan. You can go be a member of a 3-letter organization, but you have the memory now that you can't forget when you woke up for 5 minutes and remembered what your ancestors were doing. And I think this is what the antidote is for both the radical left and the right, because the leftists, they obviously want communism, but to the leftist who is of ethnic American background, he's not saying that he wants communism. He's saying that he wants a folk community as we once had on the frontier. He's saying, I need a community of individuals who is supporting me in my endeavors when now I feel so alone, because the culture itself is at the lowest form. I'm even feeling isolated from my own being, and I'm going to blame this on capitalism, because that's what my professor told me. But what if I could just show you physically through action itself how to wake up and then how to reorient yourself through a short 10-day experience? So that's kind of my business pitch to myself, or that's my challenge for myself, is how do I take these curated expeditions all over the world, and how can I focus on reawakening you to this original American concept that's always dormant in your blood, that's always there waiting. And if only we could touch grass more often, maybe we could all wake up in the same realm, and then we could create something new out of it, which goes back to that Nietzschean principle.
Yeah, and that's exactly why, though obviously being a Hapa it's a little bit more difficult because there's no unified identity, but it's also a great opportunity. And it's very Nietzschean in the sense that you do have to transvalue your past and find a new synthesis. Because I think it's easy, right? If you're Japanese, for instance, you have all this history to pull from. It's very easy to assert your identity. But as a Hapa, I have to completely make it up. And that's why I love the Nyazov example with Turkmenistan, is that he was left with this nation that was built out of the Soviet Union and then before that the Russian Empire that didn't have a history as a nation. He had to say, okay, well, we're Turkic, right? And of course the Turkics play a big role in the Hapa admixture, but he looked at, okay, we don't have a history. What are we going to do? We have to create a history. We have to create a myth to give us an axis of being. This is the word I use, an axis of being, to be in the world. Because the problem with the left is that without any positive identity, without being, you become lost to the flux multiplicities of becoming. If you never end your becoming anchored from a specific point of being, an axis of being, you can't be anything. That's why I like to say is if you could be everything, you can't be anything. And this is why I don't consider myself, even though I am a futurist and I am oriented towards appropriating technology, I would never say I'm a transhumanist. And the reason why I'd never say I'm a transhumanist is because I think the problem with transhumanism is if you don't have something that enslaves your being, you can't be free. True freedom comes from enslaving your being to a specific mode of being, a specific axis of being. And I think ethnic identity plays a big role in that, and it can't be ignored. And this is why the mass man of the left fundamentally has to excise race and identity, or racial identity and ethnic identity from their being, because once you do that, then you are like everybody else. And this is why I don't like how the minority, quote unquote, minority in America is projected onto every single ethnic group except for white. And then if you're white, you're supposed to be an ally of this great big blog and the leftist project. But what I'm getting at here is that if you want to be free, there has to be something about you that can't change. And if there was the possibility that everything about you can change, then who are you really? You're really nothing. And that's where you get into this whole ghost of a shell thing, which is tied to the transhumanism argument. It's like, what pieces of your body, when you remove them and you replace them with something else, at what point do you stop being you? So I completely agree with you. And I think that reaffirming the history of where you came from, because from that history, again, that spatial awareness of me remembering the ocean or you remembering the steppes, that's essential to how you can be in the world without being drawn into the sort of inhuman leveling that comes from the autonomous technological producing system. So I totally agree, and I encourage everybody to find that. And I think it's important that regardless of who you are, find that history, find that past, and make a relationship to it, develop a relationship to it. And I think that the project you're doing, it's not just the steppes, obviously, it's Vietnam. You said you're going to go to the Philippines. So, I mean, I absolutely endorse that. And I think everybody should sort of reaffirm that, you know?
There's this really interesting concept that Jung has where it's like, when you think about a person, most of the time he's dealing with dark forces in his unconscious that are propelling him forward. Now, he doesn't know these forces are there because he's worked so hard all of his life to repress them. You want to be a persona, and you're cutting off pieces of your identity that do not perfectly take form in this mask, and you put them behind you. And it's oftentimes what we're trying to forget that becomes the focus of our reality and moves us as our core identity without any knowledge. That's shadow possession. Now, in the same sense, we, in an Evolian form, may be moved through the world by unconscious forces that are connected with a certain blood heritage or an ancestral ritual. And what I found out with my way, and this is only a recent finding, so I'd already lived this for years and I didn't know about it until a couple of months ago, is when I look at my ancestors who came over to America, very clearly in real life, I've always been only focused on basically doing trade between Europeans and Asian tribal people. That's like literally like my entire life's job as both an academic, bringing ideas from the West to the East, East to the West, and now building trading organizations. So I've always lived that as my actual career. And it was only recently I found out where my direct ancestor in the 1600s was the first person to build trading companies between all of the Europeans in America centered around New York and the different Indian groups there, particularly with the Mohawks. We had the first trading company. So that skill that I'm living out, I didn't know I was living that out, but now I have historical evidence to suggest suggest that everyone in my family lineage had been living a variation of that out, including my grandfather, who was also very close with all these different tribes in upstate New York as well when he was alive and living there. So you're actually in the embodiment of your ancestral tradition already, and you're living that. You can choose to have a degraded version of that by participation in the surrogate activities the modern world will produce, or you can just full send it. And what if you just gave everything in your life toward the fulfillment of the ancestral identity as your core mode of being? Would that alleviate the modern man's depression? Would that alleviate the modern man's sedentary way of life? A full submission to that ancestral practice. I wonder myself.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I guess the only thing I would add on to that is I think that you also have to play a role in evolving the race over time. And this is what Julius Caesar did. The example I made was that he transitioned the Roman Republic to a Roman Empire, which became, it was still rooted in the being of being Roman, but it added to it. I think that's also a very Nietzschean concept as well, is not this idea of necessarily conserving all your practices, but then adding to them and evolving them and moving them forward. But to evolve something, you can't lose it. And that's the reason why I would say there's a distinction between an Ubermenschen figure and a transhumanist figure, because the transhumanist forgets everything in the past. And there's the Platonic ideal of amnesis, of remembering what already exists, remembering what is ideal. And there isn't any of this if you forget, in fact, what you ought to be remembering. And you remember that through reigniting these blood memories on steppe trips or going out on the Pacific or the Atlantic. And the transhumanist, and why I'm not transhumanist, despite being a futurist and proponent of reasserting the human subject's role in using technology, I think that transhumanism gets it wrong because you're trying to forget everything. You can only be by remembering. And of course, I would say you have to add to that racial character. You have to add to that, and you have to evolve it, and you have to make it even more beautiful rather than trying to preserve something in the past. But yes, I totally agree. And without having an anchor, then you're just lost in the flux. You're just lost in this wide array of choices. And at some level, freedom comes from knowing that your choice is rooted in a previous choice rather than just kind of what Kierkegaard would call the nausea of existence, this nauseous feeling of like, what the fuck am I going to do? And that's the big problem in post-modernity, is people do get lost in that flux. They do get lost in those multiplicities of being. And I think this is why post-structuralists like Derrida are just completely stupid, because that's how you get the troon. You get the troon once you strip everything of yourself and you just become the base tabula rasa consumer, essentially. And it's funny that a lot of these leftists end up coming back to serving capitalism. And why, by the way, I would argue communism is kind of a form of capitalism in a sense, because I think what you said, right? You said that most of these people don't actually want to be communists. They don't want to be capitalists anymore. They want to return to this more folk tribalistic way of life, which isn't dominated by artificial currency and artificial production that's not really necessary. But I think what communism does, similar to capitalism, is what they do is they try to make things as productive as possible. Nothing is wasted. You try to utilize and instrumentalize everything. You try to find a purpose for everything. I think that what is very evident in tradition, and going back to the traditions of the Indo-Aryan peoples or the Asian peoples or so on and so forth, is the idea that productivity is not the reason we're alive. The reason we're alive is some higher ideal, and that generally is honor. And of course, what George Bataille talks about, he talks about the Aztecs and that of potlatch. And what they did was, these merchants, they weren't merchants so that they could make profit. They were merchants so that they could make profit in honor, not in money. So they would give another king more from their king than they intended to receive back. So it was honor, the currency of honor, that took primacy over the currency of money. And I think that's something lost today. And I think that's why the communist is fundamentally no different from the capitalist, because they're just taking money and they're replacing it with use value, pure productivity. And I don't think that's the purpose of life. I think the purpose of life, and the only way we can move forward and have true progress, and this is why I would say that what you're talking about, quote unquote, progress, is not true progress, because that progress is degrading. It brings you down, it brings you lower. I think true progress is saying that life is about experience, and expanding life in the Nietzschean sense, the insatiable, dark, mysterious force, is life for life's sake. And life for life's sake is expanding experience. Modern life does not expand experience. It actually condenses it to utilitizing and instrumentalizing pleasure. So the orgasm, whether it's like pornography, that's all people are really living for anymore. They're not living for the equal parts pleasure, joy, and pain and struggle of life that I think are fundamental to this human experience and what I would call the erotic. I think that's what life is about. It's about seeking that. And you seek that on these long expeditions. You seek that by going and reaffirming your connection to your ancestors. You don't do it by forgetting all of that. And, to basically dumb down what I'm saying for the audience, or not dumb down, but to sort of summate it to what you said about Jung and the shadow self, I think the problem is that we're following the wrong ego. We're following the wrong ego. We're trying to construct the ego in a way that forgets rather than remembers. And that the ego is not the problem. The problem is how you construct the ego. And the ego has been constructed over time to fulfill the desire of being honorable. And honor was formed through years of your ancestors creating this system, which wasn't just based on productivity. It was based on a symbolic value. And that's the ego we ought to be constructing. And of course, the ego is just how you want to be viewed. And who do you want to be viewed by? Do you want to be viewed by technology and capital, in which case you just get degraded to a pleasure-seeking goblin? Or do you want to be viewed as the ego by something honorable, by something symbolic, by something higher? And I think that's the main distinction why people like you and I are not part of the homogenous element of society that has just reduced everything to pleasure, to utility, to productivity. And which is why I think your project is so important.
Well, now we can go with the Evolian, Guanonian, and the Ted Kaczynskian critique even, which is the idea of living in a modern structure. Again, the Evolian perspective is we live in an anti-structure. Now, we think of it like a minimum and maximum. The maximum very often has the appearance of the minimum has the appearance of the maximum. It's very difficult to figure out whether our values are solar or lunar, if we're oriented towards divinity or we're oriented towards something demonic. When you're living in either extreme, it is so directly related, and yet it is so beyond the other. It's very contradictory from a Jungian perspective. And when we're living in this civilization, most of the individuals are assuming the slave morality out of the womb. They're thinking like, all right, I got to be as productive as possible, and I'm going to get a lot of quantity of stuff, and that stuff is going to be good for me because I'm going to have mass production of things. Like the modern man's definition of wealth is his access to mass-produced plastic goods from China and the mass-produced chemical foods in his grocery store. Like we're literally consuming only that which is illusion. And we have a question of why I feel so discontent. You feel discontent because your being is only focused on the generation of illusion. And that's the slave. He is only consumed with his own production. It does not matter of the quality of his production. We can see moving onward in time, we rapidly go down. What is the quality of our apartments? They are the Bugman complex, the termite mound of a Chinese city. It is not something as beautiful as you would find in ancient Rome or classical American architecture when we're moving from the frontier and we're building with this Art Deco style, which again goes back to mirroring ancient Rome. Now it is only the mass produced. We say a home needs to be a cookie cutter structure that is going to be built in a suburbia of infinite sameness. Everything comes sameness, and the access to that sameness is what we identify now as progress. Really, your ancestors, they lived, what are you alive, 5 million years? 5 million years. And the best thing that you could do is live in a suburban home that you take out on a mortgage. Wow. Great. That sounds wonderful for the destiny of my people. I would be thrilled to have that. And then we see on the right, our big problem is we say, well, if I have access to resources, I just want the 1950s again, where we're all singing Kumbaya, we're working for the technological system in the factory, and I could be around my neighbors and say mean words sometimes to black people and get drunk, right? This is what we want. No. We're making a new orientation that is oriented totally away from this illusory notion, the cornerstone of your being is progress. We're thinking about quality again. How do I, as an individual, become the highest, most exceptional quality representation of my folk, of my caste, and making that my core identity, and taking the presumption that if I represent quality in itself through my action, the world can be organized into a way that suit my principles. And it may be difficult. I may be ruby ridged, in my case specifically, droned by the Chinese to death, but I must do it anyway because that is the heroic in you. It is the taking the fire of tradition and wielding it genuinely and building a new destiny for your people through act and deed, with you being the noble master and leading the individuals into the desert to make the oasis, right? That's the idea, at least, of my project. And I think I'm a very good continuation of that Evolian philosophy, taking those ideals and embodying them in real life, and maybe using a little bit too much Ted Kaczynski to guide me here and there, but that's all right. We make some mistakes.
Yeah, I think that I was going to say, you did talk about the quality of goods, for instance, and I think what makes the Japanese so amazing and their culture so rich is that you produce goods in Japan because of honor still. I mean, the way that the Japanese person, even somebody as simple as a service worker, you see just a different attitude to how they approach work. Work isn't work in the capitalistic sense. Work is work in the artisanal sense that it probably was hundreds of years ago before industrial society. And of course, I'm not saying we should return, but I think that taking certain qualitative value judgments about, well, what is the currency that we're trying to orient our ego towards? When it is honor, you get the Japanese. And you see, I love using this example because it's kind of funny, but it's also very important. And you might have seen this example in some of my videos, but there's a Japanese guy, he's like 80, 85 years old or whatever, and he makes vending machine ramen. And you think, okay, vending machine ramen, that's silly. But he wakes up every morning at 4 a.m. to make the best vending machine ramen he possibly can. He gets all the best ingredients, he gets the best noodles, and he seals it so it's still warm. And he keeps, the vending machine is like also a heater, so it keeps it warm and fresh, ready for the person to eat the vending machine ramen. But you could very easily see that in America, nobody would put that much effort into vending machine ramen. They would say, oh, I can make $5 off of some cheap materials and no effort, and I could have a robot do it for me. Sure, I'll do that, because the only value that they're orienting their ego towards is, like you said, production. So it's not quality anymore. It's just production for production's sake. And you see the Japanese person who has a mode of being that's spatially aware of its position in history and has proliferated over time through generations, that there is still this desire to be honorable. And to be honorable is to be oriented towards symbolic value, which is in complete opposition to the capitalists and the communists. So when we talk about the third path, well, what is the third path, right? It's not going back to the 1950s, like you said. We are essentially, the capitalist master is being nicer to me. I can afford a house. He's being nicer to me. That's all it is. In terms of principle, there's really no difference between the 50s and today. It just happened to be that the capitalist master, so to speak, was treating you better, right? But you had no control over your own destiny. You had no true agency in terms of the system of technology and capital. So I completely agree with you. And I think that we have to
reaffirm. Let me take you into Nomad land. Now we're getting into my people. So how did we get in this situation? The American conquering an entire nation, scalping Indians until 1924, going off to World War I, going off to World War II. Now we're suburban America. What was that transition about? And the nomads have given me the exact answer I was looking for. How do you move from the nomad into a sedentary man? And how do you begin to rationalize the sedentary as your culture? Well, it isn't a bit that Buddhist idea, you're attaching yourself to comfort and pleasure as your identity, but it's more complicated than that, because your preferences are being molded. And what the nomads have delivered to me, and we're going to take years of experience and try to condense it down, was basically that the Russians came in and they had a wonderful time doing negotiations with trade with the Imperial Russian Empire in the 1800s. And they were doing billions of dollars in trade in modern currency, just in sheep alone. So the nomads, they're trading people. They loved this when the Imperials were around, and they really didn't build too many settlements here. And they weren't really focused on taking over the whole nation in the whole series of what would now be considered nations in a way. And what happened was then the Soviets took power, and the Soviets made things a little bit difficult. And the Soviets essentially killed the grandparents, and then they enslaved the parents. And in that lineage, the third generation became so useless that they had no choice but to rationalize the Soviet Union as their ideal. Now, what does this mean? When you're a craftsman in Japan, you are usually, well, traditionally in America, in Europe, in Japan, you were part of a guild. And that guild had a series of clans that specialized in a behavior. And they were the highest level producers of a good because their entire bloodline was focused on production. If you look at an Italian and you look at his last name, he directly has an answer to this in his last name, or maybe he might be named Taylor. He might be named something with culinary arts. You can see it even in the last names of the European, that you once belonged to a clan who you can rationalize as being part of a guild, and ancestral knowledge was passing down through you. The best example of this would be in Japan. You can think of all these stereotypical samurai things. Like, for example, in Japan, I'm trying to arrange an expedition where I bring 20 Americans over to the island of Japan, where the last living blood ancestor of a samurai is alive, and he's teaching the way of the samurai publicly for the first time to foreigners. And this man, directly his lineage, fought the Mongol invasion in 1254. And I pitched him on the idea. I said, I live with the steppe folk now. Wouldn't it be cool if we paralleled the steppe folk and their warrior mentality with your folk and your samurai folk? There we go. Now that sounds cool to everybody. So we're thinking about ancestral transmission is the way to produce quality. And the nomad represents this because he says, well, how do we get from a highly skilled population of the Americans, where we produce all of our own goods, to outsourcing that to the Chinese and thus ruining our manufacturing industry? And my grandfather, on my father's side, he was a manual laborer, self-employed, and he explained to me that the Americans had this big problem back in the early 1900s. Everything we made was so superior that you would make a good and you'd sell it to the locals. They'd never need to replace it. It would never have a functional defect at all. The only problem was if a housewife didn't plug in the wall and the electrical outlet right, he would say. That's the only flaw that it could have. And so we had to sabotage our own excellence so that we could continue to generate economic output. Because if a local engineer produced, he would use the example of a fan. He could produce a fan that was of such high quality, he would sell it to everybody in his local economy. Well, after he makes 100 sales, he's done for the rest of his life. He can never recover his profit because not a single defect was made. So from that ancestral story to me, I know the American had the highest level of quality. And now thinking about the nomad, how did you move from a nomad to like a Soviet to a modern post-Soviet person? That's a very strange pathway, which is why I love working with locals. And they essentially said the Soviets killed the grandparents. They don't remember eagle hunting anymore. We have 34 eagle hunters in our nation. Eagle hunting is the most time-honored traditional skill, right there with making yurts. And traditionally, you go from the grandfather to the father to the son, teaching how to find an eagle in the wild, because we don't raise them from eggs like in Mongolia. We actually go out into the wilderness and we find an eagle and we learn how to tame the eagle, and begins to work with us all of its life. And when it gets into its twilight years, then we release the eagle. That's a weird way of having a relationship with a bird. If you can understand, we don't steal them from eggs. We have to tame them. That's a very complicated process. Now, just doing that, we went down from everybody having an eagle in every family to 34. So that's a big reduction. And what you would do is you would kill the grandparent, so he can't teach the father. The father gets confused. He has to now rely on the state because he doesn't remember exactly how to herd sheep, and he doesn't exactly know he knows the general area of where the sheep path is, but he lacks someone that just showed him that path. So now we can't be fully nomadic anymore. We have to be semi-nomadic, moving from region to region to region. And the only settlements that exist in each of these regions would be the Coal House, which would be the Soviet collective farm. So now we're doing trading with the Soviet collective farm. And soon the trader becomes the worker. And all these different ethnic tribes are now kind of, we have 40 here. Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyz 40 is the local word. So we had 40 ethnic tribes that each had dominion of a region, but now they're getting mixed in because they're economically, they're motivated in some way, however you want to quantify that as a Soviet communist. They're motivated now to settle down in a new region maybe, and relinquish their blood ties, relinquish their clan-based skills that were transmitted, and they're becoming a part of the machine. And now, because they have no connection with the past anymore, normally their grandparents were dead because of the Orkun in the early 1900s, now that everyone has died, you can't remember how to go back. You can never revitalize anything again. You forgot. You literally had the experiences ethnically cleansed from you. You can never go back. So now you have to rationalize the Soviet Union as the highest form of identity. And now you have to be in this technological prison, so to speak, because you lack the skill. So my movement is thinking about the American. How can we give them the opportunity to remind themselves that we used to represent the highest quality ideal of a folk, and we used to produce all of this quality, and we used to have entire self-sufficient movements of people like the mountain men living in Appalachia. We used to have this wonderful culture as well, and it's all been taken from us. It's all been destroyed. And the reason that we can't go beyond the technological system is because we lost those skills. We no longer have anyone we are connected to that can show us a reorientation. Instead, we focus on the school to water us down to the common level, to mix each other forever. The Asian is no longer this grand nomadic conqueror of the ocean as the Philippines once used to be. Now they're kind of this mongrel thing without any access to culture or relevant experiences and seafaring experiences. They have nothing. So they have to be a POC by default. They have to relinquish their identity by default. It's the only option that they are aware of and presented by. So rejecting that as a default pathway becomes a very core focus in my thinking.
Yeah, I totally agree. And even on the topic of domestic production, and if we had a currency that was based less on production and more on honor, could we foresee the quality of goods rising up again? Because then the purpose of work, so to speak, would have an entirely different value. And even in regards to domestic production on a wider scale, why we outsourced everything to China, clearly we did that because we wanted to have cheaper production so that we can have more money going to these big businesses, and then you could reduce consumer costs. Again, their productivity is taking the ultimate value out of, for example, the ability to wield power geopolitically. Now, if we were at war with China, they would have all the factories to be able to produce all these things. And in a large part, we have this really weird relationship with China where we purchase like 15% of the goods that they produce. And then meanwhile, they produce, again, 15% of those goods that we get from them. So we're in this weird relationship in trade wars where it's like, okay, we have to buy everything from you, but you produce it. So both of them have like a stake on each other. And you'd think geopolitically, maybe if we never outsourced all of our domestic production, we wouldn't be so reliant upon trade and the international market to be able to sustain our country. And it's precisely because the value of productivity and the value of utility and the instrumentality of all these different aspects of society, you take away the sacred element to them. This is something Nietzsche talks about, I want to say, in Twilight of the Idols, where we used to treat life as something sacred. You used to make every single thing sacred. This was the role of different cults in ancient Greece and Rome. Different cults would sacralize things like sex. They would sacralize things like the Dionysian, the party. The party was sacralized. It wasn't just this sort of thing for pleasure or status or what have you. And I think the problem of modernity, liberalism and capitalism and even communism is that you're taking away all the mystical experience of life and you're trying to rationalize it down to clearly preset inputs and outputs. And I think what we want to do, you and I, and then by extension, those that are kind of loosely related to this large web, right? Whatever the fuck you want to call it, is we want to bring back a sacred experience of life. And we want to bring back that sort of mystical view of things to the point where you can't just reduce it down to inputs and outputs. And you have to necessarily reinsert that, again, that symbolic value. It always comes back to symbolic value. And I think true of the left and the right is that the only thing that's ultimately going to produce an alternative pathway is to say, fuck productivity, fuck production, fuck utility. And maybe we have to go back to some nominal and novel form of meaning. We have to find true novelty, not this commodified sexuality. Like people say we're more sexual today than ever before. I would say it's the opposite. We're so hypersexual that there's no true sexuality anymore. Like all this OnlyFans stuff or pornography, there's nothing sexual about that in the sort of old sacred experience of the erotic and sensuality. We're in the most sexless time in human history. And it's precisely because we've brought everything down to, like you said, that great leveling, that big common denominator. And I think it's centralized around this issue of productivity, which is tied to the system of objects and capital and technology. But I think we're on the same page there, you know?
Well, I think you know, what the fuck do we want to call it? What people, the movement, the right, what do we call it? Hyperborean Right. That's the name we use from now on. Anybody that's on that wavelength, we've got the new, not the dissident right, not the conservatives. We are the Hyperborean Right. We are directly laying claim to the reclamation of the Aryan Hyperborean myth. And anyone within the circle now has my baptism into the movement. We must use this word with pride. And as you suggest, make a new mythos from our people, the Hapaborean, the Hyperborean Right. What do you think?
Yeah, I'll gladly I'll represent the Hapaborean faction of that. The Hyperborean, the Hapaborean cousins coming together to fight off the forces of modernity and the great darkness and the great ugliness that looms at the edges of our peripheral vision. But we'll fight it together, and we'll fight it strongly, and we'll reassert some new meaning and new value against all this. I guess all this degeneracy and decadence, right?
All those who are decrying modern degeneracy, we know our foe in reality. We must strike and wield the command, the power of tradition as though it were lightning to vanquish all foes.
Yeah, I'm down with that. And I think that's kind of that kind of is the thrust of the argument, and that we're trying to make here today, and what we're trying to posit. But yeah, I mean, is we're coming up at two hours now, so time flies by when you're in good company, clearly. But are there any sort of, I guess, central themes or central messages that you wanted to push out to the legionary to sort of bring everything together?
Sure, do stuff. Go outside. Stop sitting. You're sitting too much. Get in a horse. You don't know what a horse is? Buy one. I don't care. You need to do things. This incessant fixation with the right on the revolution itself being tweeting or podcasting or saying the same magical words is so futile. It is so insignificant. You need to be organized and meeting with members who are aligned with you, build a parallel economy, build a skill set, develop a clan together, take over a region, do something. Don't let a politician dictate your wills and your language. Go out with your neighbors and build and create something, establish a trade route with other like-minded individuals, and do something that is a parallel movement against whatever anti-civilization we had. If you need a practical way to wield philosophy, there you go. You've got the idea. Use it.
Absolutely. So if you have a choice, modern, sensitive young man, you can go out to the great steps and reaffirm that sort of parallel movement, or you could take the Lance Legion Salty Cove approach, join the military, but you got to do something. You have to do something. You have to be a man of action. So either reclaim your ancestral spirit or join the military and be a man of action. So pick
Now,
your path.
speaking
But yeah.
of men of action, are there any interesting adventure tales I can bestow upon you before exiting? I have to make sure I respect your time and give you enough clickbait SEO clips that you can utilize. It would be, I must humble myself for this request I am often given.
No, you're good. Do you think there's a good tale of some adventurous folk that would sort of tie everything together? A great man of history, so to speak.
Sure. I mean, I really like, and I've always focused on the adventure into the unknown as pathway to correct your wrongs. And oftentimes, it is not enough merely to combat the enemy, but to really understand the tactics the enemy uses and to use them against the enemy. Going to Vietnam and learning about the journey of Ho Chi Minh that I have now adopted just by happenstance, learning that, I hate the communists the most. Well, very clearly, the answer lies to all my problems by living with the communists for years. You might, just as you were saying, the first thing I learned in Vietnam was the communists are actually the most capitalistic people in the world, and the capitalists are the most regulated and therefore the most communist, which is very strange. So it's by adventuring in the unknown and working out these opposites that you might find some kind of higher reorientation that could propel you with such grand and vast meaning, you couldn't even imagine what that would look like now in your pathetic and miserable state. And I think that's the actionable principle, at least from Jung, because that's what I get paid to do. I get paid to go to country and teach Jungian analysis, which is kind of a cool career, living the Uber Boyo lifestyle in real life and the corporate scholastic educational world, and thinking about the opposite. How can I become my opposite? There was a time where I really wanted to be a comedian, for example, when I was still with Lance as a best friend of mine, if I can say. My focus was on creating entertainment content and different vlogs every day and becoming a social media influencer. Well, very clearly, I'm the least funny person that I know now. I mean, I just talk about Ted Kaczynski all day. That's a bit schizo. That's a bit odd. We don't do that in the comedy world on stage. But, I was pursuing the adventure as my guise to be a comedian. I was pursuing adventure as the medium of which I was expressing humor. And that medium and that adventure turned into a philosophical endeavor of where now I have all these fun international trade routes. So you devote yourself to the adventure, you devote yourself to the identity, and you try to allow the identity to come over you in such a way where you become the perfect embodiment of the philosophy that you're living. And then you can go about the world and have a more powerful sense of meaning. And I think it's until we actually go out on those experiences and be removed from the technological system and willingly accept strife and accept that struggle, then we can reawaken. But if we're going to stay in the same static base level, then we're going to be much like the Asian, the POC, where we're going to be ethnically cleansed, living in an environment of the lowest common base. The revolution in itself is the fight against the degeneracy, but that also involves adopting a very strong level of strife. And you might be getting in motorcycle accidents at 10 o'clock in the morning on the Chinese border. You might be almost dying of dehydration in the Turkmen desert. You might be looking for the rarest animal in the world with a bunch of tribal people who can't speak your language. And that's all right. That means you might be doing something right. So try to look in the place where you think is the least beneficial or the most corrupt, or the most evil, or the darkest, or the blackest. That's usually where the right answer is. And if you'd like to go with me in person on these crazy expeditions, you're more than welcome. I help content creators monetize their experiences by having meetups with their followers. If you want to contract me out to go on an adventure using my tribal network, we've got adventures in Vietnam, we've got adventures in Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Armenia, visiting monasteries. We've got renting an entire resort. I'm going to be renting a new resort in the remote part of the Philippines, and we're going to be just staffing the thing with right-wing content creators of the Hyperborean movement. And we're just going to be trying to make content and films together and going down to the Amazon. We're wrestling anacondas over in October. We're taking a tall ship expedition, maybe from the Chile into Micronesia. So if you're interested in contracting me in for sort of Hyperborean Right meetup, I'm very happy to serve you. And don't forget products. We love when someone can take our Vietnamese coffee farmers as their serfs and employ them to make your own coffee brand too. Or for cigarettes, we're thinking about making cigarette brands as well. If you need a product sourced from the third world, I'm your guy.
There you go. And I guess the way to conclude is you need to rupture the system, because the system clearly has self-organized itself in such a way that it's taking any authentic mode of being away. And you have to create rupture. That's precisely what you're talking about. You have to do things that rupture that malaise and that neurotic sort of relationship to life that has been artificially developed over time. And rupture only comes from sort of discombobulating your being. There's the Kantian experience of the sublime, and the Kantian experience of the sublime is described as giving yourself this moment of shock and awe and the witness of something truly magnificent and beautiful and sublime, that you lose your connection to reason. Now, I disagree with Kant in the sense that you can apply reason to the system of modernity, and you actually have to permanently detach yourself from that and find a positive mode of being that isn't derivative of the system of objects. So I agree with you there. Embrace rupture. Try to rupture your connection to this sort of decaying world and find a more authentic mode of being. But thank you for speaking with me, Rogue. And there's a couple last things I was going to say. I was going to say, Legionaries, if you end up thinking, you know what, this expedition stuff sounds good, I want to go on an adventure, reach out to me and maybe we'll put something together. If we have enough people that want to do this, then we'll talk to Rogue and see if we can put it together. And besides that, do you want to show them your suit?
Sure. So I know this is a big thing in your movement. I obviously love fashion. Like, let's just go over some fashion articles for the aesthetic movement, right? People talk about aesthetics. They wear t-shirts. They wear jeans that are chemically dyed. This is ridiculous, right? We have to go in and contract tailors who can make something handmade. So here what I wear every day, by the way, this is my normal clothes. I was wearing this last night to the opera, by the way. If you're, what does he do in his free time? I like to go to the opera. So I was in the opera and we wear these things called chapans. These are long flowing robes. And these robes go all the way down to my feet. Normally we wear them with these big Soviet kind of jackboot military things. And we've got one chapan, which is very long. And we've got a second one, which is actually designed in a suit style. So mirroring American suit. But more importantly, for the Europeans in the audience, I have a personalized collection of As you can see here, this is a teal color. This is a replica of Mussolini's suits. This one has a little distinction where it's got buttons on the side very uselessly, but I have a blue and teal personalized collection of Mussolini suits that I wear to lectures every day, where I lecture on Evola and Nietzsche in a purple suit or wearing a long flowing cloak. So I think fashion and the aesthetic, if that's going to be your focus, you've got to do something that is beyond the mass-produced man. We cannot just call ourselves aristocrats of the soul and wear t-shirts, burn them, burn the t-shirts, wear cashmere. Everything you wear should be the representation of your philosophical standpoint. And this is not a pretend, this is not a dress up. You have to embody the spirit of the ideals that you live in every aspect of life. Even if you're going to the gym, you can't just wear a t-shirt there either. You got to wear some interesting Dragon Ball Z looking robes as well, or maybe some Shaolin monk thing. You can just do that. It's all right. You have to embody the ideals and represent them very proudly and elegantly, especially in my case, where I'm an immigrant in a nomadic nation. So I need to wear all of their outfits constantly to show respect to the local folk. It's very important for me to honor the locals in every nation that I go to.
And in my defense, Rogue is currently in nighttime. I'm in the morning, so I just wear my old Marine t-shirt. So I apologize for not being more fashionable. I would have put on something. Next time I'll wear something better. I'll wear a big suit.
You've got to burn the t-shirts. You have to only wear long flowing storm cloaks. This is the absolute ideal of the movement. We're all going to dress. Everybody's got long cloaks. You have to have the belt holding it all together to showcase your large frame. It's great to ride on horses as well. Keeps you cool in the day and warm at night. This is the kind of things we need to implement. We can't just be the mass man who wears chemically dyed t-shirts. You need to have serfs that chemically dye your clothing for you, like I have in Vietnam.
There we go. Yeah, next time when I'm able to visit you, I'll bring an extra suitcase and I'll just bring back like 10 different suits.
Absolutely. Dude, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take 20 total guests. We're going to source from you and Lance. We're going to do an expedition in the Ho Chi Minh Trail together with 20 guys, and we're going to see if we can survive. I just did a trial run right now. I dropped a bunch of dudes off on an island after teaching them different hunting and trapping skills with 4 different ethnic tribes. And we're going to do the same thing for you, but we're going to go even further in the jungle this time, and we're going to just see if we can survive off of foraging, because that's what we do here. We go on fun little expeditions. We meet our followers, and we get to make lifelong connections. We get to see, well, if you're a person who signs up for these expeditions, does my social media leader who I worship, does he actually live his embodied principles? Was he really a Marine out in the fields? Does he know how to forage for food and make a shelter? Now you get to judge too. It's fun.
A lot of pressure, but I'll have to live up to the, I am, because of my Filipino ancestry, I have this thing called G6PD deficiency. So it's similar to how black people have the sickle cell problem, but it makes you resistant to malaria. So maybe I'll have a little bit of an advantage in Vietnam. So finally my deficiency will have some positive effect out there. Maybe I won't catch malaria.
See, when you throw yourself back into the ancestral climate, magically God is providing you an avenue to ensure that your survival is at a higher characteristic, right? I trade with different tribal folk. That's what my ancestors did. I have success here. We just need to put you on a boat going down the Vietnamese and Cambodian river systems.
Ooh, Apocalypse Now style.
Exactly. That's what we do. An Apocalypse Now themed meetup going down those same river systems with you and Lance. We'll all get different boats. We'll go in groups of 5. We'll see who survives best. We'll do some challenges. It'll be fun.
Sounds good. I can't wait to be smoking on the river with an M60, getting attacked by tigers and shit. But well, thanks Rogue for speaking with me. We'll stay in touch. And again, Legionaries, if this is something you're interested in, reach out to me and I'll reach out to Rogue, and then we'll see if we can set something really cool up and be actual Legionaries in person. Of course, a lot of people on the channel are either in the military or planning to be in the military. I think this would be a pretty good adjacent activity if you've been in the military or want to be in the military or are in the military. So reach out to me. We'll get something to happen. But without further ado, Awe Nova Roma, Awe Caesar, Awe Changus, Awe Rogue Scholar, and this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the Warrior Philosophy. We will see you next time, perhaps on an adventure down the river.